ain't real shit anymore.
You have to have these difficult conversations.
So the movement is about equality.
More for Black Americans. That was a really intense debate.
Let's just keep it strictly about facts and we'll be good.
I mean, this is a verbal fight. Mm-hmm. I mean,
it is.
We invite you to be a part of the league and participate in actually debating.
Can you hear me now?
Good evening, Great Debate League. I'm your moderator and host for this evening, Ebony Johnson. We appreciate you for taking part in tonight's debate. I hope that you will engage with us in our comments section throughout the evening. Tonight's debate is sponsored by They Know Joey Foundation, a 501c3 focused on entrepreneurial development. For more information, visit knowjoeyfoundation.org. We debate to elevate, and tonight's premise and debaters are sure to take us higher. Tonight's premise, spirituality is a form of escapism for many African Americans. Arguing the affirmative, Tre Scott, a Sacramento, California native with a degree in biology. Arguing the negative, Catina K. a Kansas City, Missouri native, lawyer, and educator. Tonight's judges, Familiao Equindeo, a native of Lagos, Nigeria, and an aspiring travel journalist. Talani Deskins, an Oakland, California native with a passion to free his people from white supremacy. Adonica Shaw, a Southern California native and owner of a tech company. Tonight's guiding definitions: spirituality, a sense of connection to something greater than ourselves, typically involving a search for meaning in life. Escapism, mental diversion from unpleasant or boring aspects of daily life. Parameter, religion and Christianity are not spirituality. This is a ranked debate. The rules are as follows: no personal attacks of any kind, no profanity, and no interrupting. Both participants are allowed to call a fact-check timeout only during one of their designated speaking times. The Great Debate League provides an opportunity to sharpen your voice and broaden your perspective. We invite you all to join the league. We will now begin round one, opening statements. Each participant will provide an uninterrupted opening statement. We will begin with Tre Scott, arguing the affirmative. Tre, you have 4 minutes.
Thank you. During tonight's debate, I will be using the terms African Americans, Black Americans, and Blacks interchangeably. Premise: is spirituality a form of escapism for many African Americans? During pre-debate, we agreed that spirituality is a sense of connection to something greater than ourselves, typically involving the search for meaning in life. We also agreed that escapism can be defined as mental diversion from unpleasant or boring aspects of daily life. And we further agreed that religion and Christianity are not spirituality. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy defines epistemology as the study of knowledge or understanding. In a 2017 article for Psychology Today, Dr. Jeremy Sherman, who holds a PhD in evolutionary epistemology, states, there are face-it and escapist coping strategies. Face-it strategies supply us with the calm fortitude to face our reality more realistically. Escapist strategies encourage us to ignore the features of our reality that induce stress. The most escapist coping strategies tend to come bundled with optimistic, absolute faith philosophies, religious, spiritual, political, otherwise. Faith is coping by hoping, embracing an optimistic belief that things will work out the way that your philosophy predicts they will. These reduce stress by narrowing your perspective. I'll cling to my faith and ignore everything that counters it. Accentuating the positive means eliminating the negative. Dr. Jacqueline Mattis is the Dean of the School of Arts and Sciences at Rutgers University, Newark, and holds a PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Michigan, where she was previously a professor. Per her university bio, her research focuses on the role of religion and spirituality in the lives of African American and Afro-Caribbean youth and adults, and on the factors that are associated with positive psychological and psychosocial development of urban residing African Americans and Afro Caribbeans. In particular, she uses quantitative and qualitative methods to explore the factors that contribute to things such as volunteerism, civic engagement, altruism, compassion, empathy, forgiveness, optimism, and positive parenting. She states, there's something that happens when life pushes you to your final limits that makes you develop a personal sense of what's sacred, what's important. If you're religious and spiritual, the spiritual part is the part that makes you develop a relationship with a God that's bigger than you in a way that no one can define for you. It's just you and that one being. Escapism, you and that one being. The Pew Research Center, PRC or Pew, is a nonpartisan fact tank that informs the public about the issues, attitudes, and trends shaping the world. According to Pew, only 18% of African Americans identify as unaffiliated, while 82% of African Americans self-identify as religious. Of that 82% segment, 96% identify as Christian, while approximately 4% as belonging to non-Christian faiths. But let's take a closer look at that 18% reporting as unaffiliated. Of that group, 61% report they're not affiliated with a particular religion, but religion is important to them. That 61% represents 11% of the whole. So instead of saying that 82% of African Americans are religious, we could actually talk in terms of an incredible 93% of African Americans being religious. My opponent will argue that religion and Christianity absolutely are not synonymous with spirituality. And while I firmly believe that intersectional academics like my opponent have the ability to travel seamlessly in those different lanes, it is my opinion, supported by both scientific data and non-scientific anecdata, that the separation is not absolute. In fact, the data shows there is so much overlap between faith and spirituality among African Americans that the two are more synonymous than not. The reasonable conclusion, therefore, is that most African Americans are quite comfortable with the overlap, even though the intersectional academic community may choose to deal mostly in clearly defined theoretical spaces where concepts and practices operate independently. For many, if not most Black Americans, the practical realities do not necessarily align with the theoretical positions held by the academic community. Again, I agree that Christianity and religion do not always equal spirituality with a perfect one-to-one relationship. However, they overlap to such a significant degree that it would be dismissive, if not somewhat disrespectful even, to not include religion as an integral element of spirituality among African Americans. It is also important to note that escapism is a necessary part of life in America and all over the world. And spirituality actually helps African Americans because it provides a necessary escape. Thank you.
And now for Catina Taylor, arguing the negative. Catina, you have 4 minutes.
Thank you, and good evening, everyone. Again, my name is Catina Taylor, and I am arguing the negative. Why do we pose questions in the binary as if there are only 2 answers to any questions? I've said before, and I'll say again, that Black identifying people are not a monolith. Therefore, what is true for one is not necessarily true for another. Understand that either or thinking is a characteristic of white supremacy ideology meant to eliminate options, thereby making control of the oppressed easier. I'm just saying. Religion, Christianity, and spirituality are not one and the same. However, they are often used synonymously. Spiritual escapism, or bypassing, coined in 1984 by John Wellwood, a Buddhist teacher, and a white man. Why do I point that out? Why is that important? Because he was doing this, as was others who were practicing Buddhism. We must stop applying things to ourselves that are not relative to us. He was a psychotherapist as well. And what he said as to spiritual escapism and bypassing is this: it's a tendency to use spiritual ideas and practices to sidestep or avoid facing unresolved emotional issues, psychological wounds, or unfinished developmental tasks. Let's be clear and recognize that what we are talking about this evening is spirituality, defined as a sense of connection to something greater than ourselves, typically involving a search for meaning in life. It is a journey, not a destination. Spirituality enables one to see the impact and consequence of flawed human behavior, not ignore it. To seek personal evolution, growth, truth, and maturity naturally dismantles the mental fog that exists when one chooses to avoid growth and escape from it, all through religion and Christianity. Spirituality forces us to be brave and courageous enough to ask the tough questions and see ourselves for who we have been, who we are, and explore who we might become. Where is the escape? Where is the denial? It is messy, painful, and necessary work that requires a decision to be made without wanting to become better and do better. Nowhere in that can an individual come close to escaping what is true about him or herself. As Iyanla Vanzant would say, it forces you to own your ish. Spirituality is merely a tool to prevent one from being overtaken by unresolved issues, but certainly not a tool that prevents one from recognizing and dealing with those issues. What does spirituality lead to? Volunteerism, social responsibility, optimism, contributing to society, connectedness with others, grounding, a relationship with God, and values. All of those modalities support transformation rather than replacing it. No more than liberation from cancer is a form of escapism from disease. Enlightenment being a form of escaping from the world is like extreme wealth being a form of escaping from poverty. A perfect love being a form of escaping from loneliness. A complete happiness being a form of escaping from sadness. Thank you.
We will now begin round 2. This is the lightning round, which allows for an open cross-examination between both participants to engage in interrogation of their opponent's position. This is a shared time frame for both debaters. Audience, please listen carefully and pose your questions for our debaters, as audience Q&A is the next round. This round is 20 minutes. Debaters, you may begin.
Are escapism and escapist behaviors positive, negative, or neutral?
The behaviors themselves, that depends on the individual. I know that we would like to couch ourselves in absolutes, but there are absolutely no absolutes, right? And so again, as I say, the African American people are not a monolith, nor are the total population of on earth, right, of society, a monolith. It depends on the people. Now, if you get stuck in those characteristics and stay there, they can be negative for you. In a moment, in a blip of time, when you've suffered a trauma or suffered some harm, just like in the stages of grief, you can stay there. You can be there in a moment. As long as you don't couch yourself and sit there, then it's not necessarily a negative for you. Our human body, you know, we can talk about religion, we can talk about faith, we can talk about Christianity, we can talk about spirituality, but we can't do those things in isolation. You as a biologist must know that our bodies, right, they respond to all the things that we experience. And so in saying that, I would say that our fight or flight response kicks in. And so where we may have to immediately rely on our faith, our spirituality to deal with the initial harm, then we move it beyond that. And that can be positive for us.
Okay, so you see the value in spirituality as escape, as an escape from the harm that disease can ravage on the body, and not just the disease itself, but also if we think about what harm can happen to someone who we witness, a loved one who was going through something, through an illness, or those steps preceding their death, what it does to the minds of their loved ones. Do we not agree, or can we not agree that spirituality is a beneficial part of helping them to process and deal with those things that are hard to watch with respect to our physical health?
It certainly can be beneficial in the initial phases of dealing with a harm or a trauma. But remember, what the question is simply that, is it a form of escapism that most African Americans utilize so that they're not dealing with psychological or emotional harm? And if you heard what I said before, I said you can start there, but as long as you don't sit there and stay there, then it can be a positive thing. So if you think about the stages of grief, denial, anger, depression, bargaining, and acceptance, it's the same thing. I mean, you can actually see the road that people travel to get there, right? And so it may start with their religious beliefs, the religious indoctrination that they have taken on, right? And then they move to their Christian faith, right? Like, so that's more robust. And then they're eventually going to get to their spiritual journey. So just like they move through the stages of grief, ideally, and in most instances, people are going to move from the superficial things that are man-made in religion and Christianity and get to the higher arc, which is spirituality. And it doesn't make them, or it doesn't reveal itself in a way to escape. It actually causes them to be in tune with everything around them at the time, because that's the only way that you get to true spirituality.
And I think that one of the things that we didn't necessarily get into was, I mean, and you can certainly make that argument now, you know, during this time that we have together, the notion of just an entry-level spirituality versus a true spirituality. What do we really know? You mentioned the term escapism, and you're saying, well, okay, if I want to get to that true spirituality, I'm going to go through this door first. Well, if you're trying to get out of a box that you're trapped in, you got to open the door first, even if you don't know your way all through the tunnel out to the light. You still got to start that journey one step at a time, and that starts by opening the door to make this escape. And I'm not saying that this is negative, that this is a negative thing. I don't believe that the escapism is necessarily a bad thing. I believe that when they presented the question to us, that there may have been many viewers who assumed a negative connotation with escapism, which, as you've alluded to, would be this sort of not accepting or not wanting to face what's really going on.
Well, let's make sure that we stay on task here, right? So the argument is, do most African Americans use spirituality as a form of escapism? We're not arguing whether it's negative or positive. That's not what we're arguing. We're arguing whether or not it's being used in a way to, and as per the definition, to avoid dealing with emotional trauma, distress, emotions, you know, all of these things. So let me say this. Some signs of emotional bypassing or escapism are these: not focusing on the here and now, living in a spiritual realm much of the time, overemphasizing the positive and avoiding the negative, being self-righteous about the concept of enlightenment, being overly detached, being overly idealistic, having feelings of entitlement, exhibiting frequent anger, engaging in cognitive dissonance, being overly compassionate, pretending that everything is okay and when it's not. And when have we as a collective sat in that space on an ongoing and long-term basis? My argument is that we have not. Why do I say that? Well, let me tell you why I say that. Because we've gone through the transatlantic slave trade, the Middle Passage, slavery itself, emancipation, Reconstruction, sundown towns, Jim Crow, civil rights, Black Lives Matter today. All of us have been aware of the things that we have experienced and lived through every single generation. If we were just escapists, then we would have accepted our state in life, our stance in life, and we wouldn't have revolted. We wouldn't have had uprisings. We wouldn't have marched. We wouldn't have rioted. We wouldn't have debated. We wouldn't have pushed forward legislation. Escapism says that you are not addressing those things, right?
I believe that the escapism definition that you're using is a little bit too tight. I believe that in centering it just on that escape portion, which is, okay, I'm not gonna face the things that are traumatic, and that are not only just traumatic in the moment, but are traumatic and ongoing. When you're describing our history as a people, which you've done an eloquent job of doing, you're talking about hundreds of years, centuries of ongoing things from which we literally had to escape. You mentioned talking about the escape from Jim Crow. If we go back into the 19th century, talking about those first migrations as we left the South and went to the North and to the Midwest and even further out West, the churches provided spiritual coping tools, a form of escape from that ongoing oppression that we as a people were still experiencing even after we had physically escaped from the bondage of slavery and then the post-Reconstruction era that was absolutely terrible for many of us. So we're talking about spirituality and religiosity being worked in there as things that provided the escape, not only that we needed, that were absolutely integral to our very survival as a people.
So I'm gonna ask the question that someone else asked then. Is coping escapism?
I believe that religious coping on any level can begin as escapism, and that's totally okay. Because I don't see escapism as something that is entirely negative. I believe I would not sit here and say there's a net neutral definition, meaning firm box for escapism. Because when we talk about escapism, a lot of people may throw in terms like addictions, like drug use or what have you, pornography, anything. Those can be temporary escapes, temporary momentary escapes. But at the same time, kneeling in prayer can provide a temporary escape. How many times have you experienced someone say simply, "Please, Lord," or words to that effect, because they just needed a moment? It was a moment.
And I think a moment is what we need to really center on here is this. When we're asking the question, is spirituality a form of escapism for most African Americans, then perhaps we should have included some additional, definitions or clarification, right? So the way in which I interpret that question and the way in which I am arguing my position is simply this, is that if we never get to the low self-esteem, the social isolation, the emotional issues that we face, then we stay stuck. But that has not been the case for most African Americans, right? And so therefore, I can't ever say that for most African Americans, our spiritual practices lead to escapism, because we are not stuck. We continue to move. We continue to overcome. We continue to fight back and develop and innovate and all of those things. Therefore, we certainly cannot say that a spirituality is a form of escapism. In a moment, in a blink of an eye, when you first experience something, yes. Long term, absolutely not. There's no way that we could be denying the things that we experience as a collective, because that's the way in which the question is couched. Most African Americans, a collective, absolutely not. There's no way.
As a collective, we continue to progress as a people. There's no question about that. I think we would just agree on that, from base. But if you look at how we progress, we're progressing stepwise. And one of the things that came up in a different conversation was that we are not starting at our endpoint. As you and I have this conversation today, you are a very important part. And I don't mean to take your private and professional into this, but you're doing actual work there with Dreams KC that is part of that progression. I read about you. You are definitely a part of that. And I'm sure that some of the faith traditions that are moving you and inspiring you in your work help you to understand that you personally are helping young people to escape what may have been a station for them that was just there and determined before they were even born. So you're not necessarily escapism in terms of, okay, we ain't got to deal with it. No, you're providing that leveling up. And that leveling up is a form of escape. If you look at where we escaped from in
We're 16... Trey, let me interrupt you. Let me slow you down and interrupt you. In your opening statement, you relied on academic definitions of many terms, right, that we're dealing with tonight. In escapism, you can't choose to rely on the academic definitions on the one hand and then throw them out with the other, right? So I think you're thwarting your argument by saying, well, I'm not saying escapism is a bad thing, or, that
escapism is positive and negative. My argument was that people, the theoretical people, might look at the term and the use of it in the way the question was presented as a negative. And I'm saying that it's both negative and positive. Go ahead.
Take a side. That's all I'm gonna say. Take a side.
No,
and so when you talk about the progression of the collective can progress without the individuals progressing themselves. And so that means mentally, emotionally, psychologically, physically, and all of those things. If we were stuck in escapism, as it's defined academically, which is what you relied on, right? The academic definitions there. If we relied on escapism in that context, then it has to be negative in nature because it's defined from an academic standpoint as an inability to deal with your emotional stress, your trauma, all the things that we deal with, the underdevelopment, the lopsided. Let me read something to you. Aspects of spiritual bypassing include exaggerated detachment, emotional numbing and repression, overemphasis on the positive, anger phobia, blind or overly tolerant compassion, weak or too prosperous boundaries, lopsided development, cognitive intelligence often being far ahead of emotional and moral intelligence. Like, if we're going to stick to the academic definitions of these things, then it automatically and necessarily is negative. And what I am saying is that spirituality as is not a form of escapism in the negative sense, because if it were, there is no way that we wouldn't be alive. Like the world would have swallowed us up by now.
There's no question.
You got to choose. You got to choose. Like, you can't.
I will agree with you on the point that if it were a net negative, that we would have been, we would have destroyed and swallowed ourselves. We would have been swallowed up. I agree with that. But I do not agree. I cannot concede that it's always negative. And that's where I have to really admire you for agreeing to take the debate, because the term escapism provides me both an outlet that's positive, and also if I want to go back down the hole, that could be done as well. We know that it doesn't, we don't have to go into too many examples of how escapism, when we use it negatively, does harm the soul. It harms the spirit. But when we need to repair the spirit, well, there's spirituality, our search for something greater, that relationship with something bigger than ourselves. That's something that, according to all the research, says that most African Americans believe in.
They believe in religion. They believe in Christianity. Not all are settled in what spirituality means for them. But let's get back to who coined the phrase, right? So he said spiritual bypassing or escapism. Wellwood. When spiritual practice is used to compensate for challenging traits such as low self-esteem, social isolation, or other emotional issues, Wellwood said they correct the actual use of spiritual practice. In other words, using these practices to cover up problems seems like an easy way out, as opposed to working on the actual issues and etiology of the challenges. In our community, spirituality is the tool used to unearth these things, not to cover them up. Not to cover them up.
Okay, and I appreciate your statement there to close. You stated spirituality is a tool. That is the argument that I'm making. It is the tool.
Well, thank you for helping me with my argument then.
I understand, but see, now you got to accept that affirmative, because it is the tool. And I'll speak, growing up African American in the South, where everyone, literally everyone, had some sort of faith-based education, even if it was simply having conversations at school about Bible stories. We're talking about religiosity as the foundation from which we began to develop our personal spiritualities. One of the things that I discovered during the research here is that when we speak about religiosity, and this is coming from Dr. Mattis, that typically will be in line with what are the practices that people are doing, or we're talking about prayer and etc. But then when we get into spirituality, we're talking about relationships. So they're actually working hand in hand with one another. The spiritual escape that's provided by our search for personal spirituality, because it is so personal to me anyway, that's my way of thinking, is the escape needed to help us cope. Religious coping, personal spirituality, they're working hand in hand. And I don't think that we're unique as African Americans in using that.
Let's dive into that a little bit, right? So liberation, achieving enlightenment, that goes beyond coping, right? That goes beyond coping. So I want to share this. Can spirituality be a form of escaping? It could be. The pursuit of it, absolutely, very often motivated by the desire to escape reality one can't or doesn't want to deal with. Yeah. The drive to escape doesn't lead to enlightenment. It leads to spiritual sounding separation, withdrawal, and avoidance. It leads to the witness who sits back, away from life, disconnected and unaffected. That this witness is a step towards enlightenment is a common idea. Unfortunately, this idea is not accurate. Achieving enlightenment, achieving liberation requires full and complete presence with everything as everything. It requires a complete, total acceptance of everything and immersion in everything. It requires moving towards, plunging in, and becoming completely one with everything. That is the very opposite of escaping and avoiding, as coined by the person who started the phrase, right? So the argument is, are we escaping or are we not? My position is we are not.
You're talking about a person who used one term there with the spiritual bypassing, but that's not necessarily, that's so finite. And when we think about spirituality, we can't really think in those types of terms. Spirituality is so all encompassing.
But that's not our argument tonight. We're not arguing whether it's finite or infinite, whether it's surface or deep. What we're arguing is whether or not spirituality is used as a form of escapism. Absolutely not.
I think it's
we couldn't survive if we did.
I believe that it's the exact opposite. I see the answer, the truth is the exact opposite of what you put forward.
I know what you believe, but what can you prove, Tre?
I can prove it. And not only that, you have actually made the statement during this debate that spirituality is a tool. That's the most important thing that's come out of this, is that spirituality is not a destination. I think that you stated that as well. It is a journey, and it's also a tool. It is all those things. That's what's so amazing about spirituality, because spirituality is the essence of who it's how we express ourselves as Black Americans. It is everything about how we express ourselves, because we know that we're the foundation of humanity in this universe.
I would like to believe that. And I know that this may ruffle some feathers. Dang it. Time.
Please, I will yield time so that you complete that statement.
Well,
please.
You don't have, this is a shared time frame, so you don't have any time to yield, Tre. But you too can. Remember, you have closing statements. We have Q&A coming up, so you can work in other statements. Thank you so much for that engaging lightning round. We will now begin round 3, the audience question and answer round. We invite our audience to submit questions for the debaters. Each participant will be given the chance to respond to each question, uninterrupted. Please submit your questions now. As we bring up our audience questions, please support our growth by donating to our Cash App, $The Great Debate League. Check us out on our YouTube channel, Great Debate League Inc., and become a member of our Patreon page. We are also on Instagram, and you can subscribe to our podcast on Spotify and iHeartRadio. They Know Joe Foundation will have its 14th annual Fresh Cut, Fresh Start taking place on August 22nd, 2021. And now we will take our first audience question.
Yay.
Bruce is going to bring that up here, and we're going to allow you, Tre, to argue in the affirmative to answer first. This is from Judge Deskins. How has spirituality helped us in our struggle? You have 1 minute and 30 seconds.
Okay, I want to say thank you for this great question, Judge. Spirituality has been integral to our struggle because of the fact that spirituality enabled and allowed for a commonality for Black Americans, regardless of where we were coming from. You know, we're talking about during the colonial period, all the way until now. It still provides that common bond among peoples. So it is definitely something which helps with the struggle. Not only does it help provide a common bond, what it does is I could go through any myriad of traumas that we've experienced collectively, and I think that my opponent did an excellent job of outlining many of those, tonight. And through each of those, at any point, we collectively could have said enough. But the spirituality provided us the strength and was a tool for us to press on. And as we press on, we continue to rise. So it has definitely been beneficial to the struggle.
Forgive me, my mic was muted. Katina, we will ask you the same question from Judge Deskins. How has spirituality helped us in our struggle? You have 1 minute and 30 seconds.
I think first and foremost, it's allowed us to be centered, so to speak. It's allowed us to evolve, mature, and really look at our individual selves and our collective selves in the mirror and address who we are in the midst of our struggle. It's allowed us to have Black Wall Street, the Haitian Revolution, Greenwood, Obama, Black Lives Matter. It has kept us from losing our minds in the midst of insurmountable genocide sometimes. It has allowed us to keep our families, communities, individual selves, and collective continuing to move forward. So that is the way in which I see spirituality helping us in our struggle. Ebony, you're mute. We can't hear you.
Sorry, I keep muting myself to lower my background. Now we will take our second question from the audience. And as we here we go. Okay. Is it conceivable that spirituality isn't a form of escapism, but perhaps a mechanism to reinforce one's cultural or racial identity? Tre, you have 1 minute and 30 seconds. Tre,
mechanism. Say again.
Go ahead.
Okay. Hi. I would argue that it's not a mechanism exclusive and solely apart from and at the expense of escapism. That escapism is part and parcel of what spirituality is. So I would include the escapism component of spirituality, and I would say that yes, it is a mechanism to reinforce one's cultural and racial identity. When we talk about the huge number of African Americans who identify as religious in this country, I mean, that's a much bigger number than I had anticipated. When I first began thinking about this question, I was thinking in my mind, okay, so about 76% or whatever the number is of African Americans are Christian or religious, and I kind of put them in the same box. But in reality, it's much bigger than that. So when we think about who we are as African Americans, we are the most religious group in America, period, bar none. It's not even close, really. And so I think that just in a very anecdotal sense, it is important to a lot of African Americans' cultural identity. They consider it very important to follow the faith traditions of their family. I'm going to share with you a link here. I actually decided to run a survey myself for this particular question, and so I'll let you guys check that out to participate at your as you wish.
All right, and that's time. Katina, we will ask you the same question. Is it conceivable that spirituality isn't a form of escapism, but perhaps a mechanism to reinforce one's cultural or racial identity? You have 1 minute and 30 seconds.
It don't take that. I'm an attorney, right? Like I have a law degree. So I answered the question as, yes, it's conceivable. We don't really need to add a whole lot. But I would like to remind people this certain thing is that religious faith, Christianity, church, like let's be real, that is not what equals spirituality. And when we tout data, I think we have to be very careful. Who assembled that data? Who did they talk to? What was their sample size? All of those things go into how in which we, present findings. And again, I want to remind people what spirituality is: a sense of connection to something greater than ourselves, typically involving a search for meaning in life. And what I have found is that in many churches and religious organizations and institutions, that is not what's happening. It is acquiescing to, assimilating to man-made rules, regulations, and really and truly, oftentimes can be oppressive in nature.
Mm-hmm.
All right, and now for our third audience question. How do you prove that spirituality is a higher version of religion? Catina, we will let you answer that question first. You have 1 minute and 30 seconds.
I believe that the way in which you prove that spirituality is a higher version of religion is simply by looking at what happens. And what do I mean? What happens in practice, in application. So when we look at, I could think of an individual like it just came right before my face. Someone that has spent their entire lives in a religious institution, yet they haven't evolved as an individual. That's religion. That's church. That's oftentimes Christianity. That's denomination. Spirituality, however, when I've encountered people that really have taken on that journey, because remember, it's a journey and not a destination, you see real evolution. You see them looking in the mirror and admitting their faults, their failures, as well as their greatness, their value, and their worth. And I think that that's how you prove it, but it's a case-by-case basis, individual by individual, because it is a personal journey for people. It is nothing prescribed, and that journey looks very different for every individual that makes a decision and a choice to go on that journey. So that's a way in which you can prove it. Talk to them, engage with them, look for the attributes of spirituality versus man-made religion and Christianity as it was given to us.
Thank you so much. We will ask a different question to you, Tre. Are spiritual healing practices a form of escapism? You have 1 minute and 30 seconds.
Well done, moderators. I appreciate the switch up there. I would argue that spiritual healing practices can be a form of escapism. Keep in mind that I'm looking at escapism along a very broad spectrum. Spiritual healing is very important to many people within our community. In fact, one of the things that also came up in the research, and I'll provide you the link, was with regard to younger people looking more towards this sort of spirituality, which is diminishing the role of their family's faith in their own personal spiritual journeys. Now, there's a lot of charlatans out there. That's not going to go unspoken. But I believe that the spiritual healing practices that are in spiritual reading, things like that, are things that provide an escape that is both positive, could be negative, but is also necessary for many people. We're talking about healing. Those are the things that allow us to go on. When we're damaged, we need to heal. However we get that healing, however we get it, is a net positive. And so, yes, spiritual healing practices can definitely be a form of escapism and one that is good for us as people.
Thank you, Tre. And now for our final audience question for both of you. And this is from Tre Scott. I hope I made that pronunciation correctly. Is the church and spirituality we're discussing today the same as what previous generations experienced? Or is the church and spirituality today filled with prosperity gospel and commodification such that the church cannot be a healthy escape? Catina, you have 1 minute and 30 seconds.
I love this question, and thank you, Ms. Scott, for asking this question. So I certainly think that there are generational issues to address in this argument, this debate, right? This discussion. And so I don't believe at all that we're discussing church and spirituality in a way that is the same for previous generations as it is today. And Tre made a point in his last statement saying that young people, youth of today, people of today are diminishing the roles of their families in their faith. Well, my position is simply that spirituality is an individual thing. the evolution of self, because you arrive here individual, you will leave here individual. Now, that doesn't mean that dash in between doesn't mean that you make impacts and you work with people and family and community and all of those things you do, right? But this journey of spirituality toward purpose, liberation, right? It is an individual thing. Now, the other thing you said, is the church and spirituality today filled with prosperity, gospel, and commodification such that the church cannot be a healthy escape? It depends on where you look. There is no single answer for any single thing. It depends on where you look and where you are in your own evolution as to whether or not it can be, and I won't use the term escape, I'll use a place to assist you in your evolution spiritually.
Thank you, Catina. Tre, the same question for you. Is the church and spirituality we're discussing today the same as what previous generations experienced? Or is the church and spirituality today filled with prosperity gospel and commodification such that the church cannot be a healthy escape? You have 1 minute and 30 seconds.
I don't like absolute terms. And so when I see something like a cannot, I'm going to push back on that initially. So I wouldn't say the church cannot be a healthy escape, even if we're talking about materialism. This church can still provide what it needs to people who may need whatever that thing is. And I believe that my opponent stated, as such, that what you look for is often what you will find. And I believe the church can support that, no matter where you are on this journey or on this journey. I believe the churches can still support that. To answer the first question, is the church spirituality different than previous generations' experience? Absolutely, and without question. Previously, the church was way more about survival and survival of our people as collective than it is today. I know that the struggle does continue. But the struggle that we have today is not the same struggle as existed 100 years ago, 200 years ago. So I would argue that the spirituality and the church working in concert they're just not the same, because people have different needs now. Are there still people who have those temporal needs, the same ones that existed as, again, we talked about those great migrations where we went from poverty and racism in one place to poverty and racism in another place, discrimination in another place. Those things are still and still can be true. But I would say that prosperity gospel itself is something that is brand new for the church.
All right, thank you so much, Tre. And now we're going to go to our closing statements. Each debater will be able to provide an uninterrupted closing statement. You have 4 minutes each. We will hear the affirmative closing statement from Tre Scott.
I just wanted to use my time effectively to talk about the prosperity thing. What's interesting is that there was an article in Christianity Today which stated that some 38%, actually released in 2018 study, sorry about that, that 38% of evangelicals believe that their churches teach that if they donate money, that God will give them favor. Among Black Americans only, that number goes to 51%. So I think that's probably not what was existing, 100 years ago in the Black church as the Black churches participated in and provided support and resources for people on their spiritual journey. I think it's important to get back to the original question that was asked today, which is whether or not the African American community have spirituality as a form of escapism. And unfortunately for my opponent, and I do have the highest regard for her, I think that she has done a tremendous job of educating the viewers tonight. But unfortunately, the question itself about escapism and the definition of escapism is not trapped in this one little thing. And when we talk about spirituality is if you ask someone to define what awe is, what does the word AWE actually mean? We're all going to have a different definition, and none of our definitions fit in that little box. It just doesn't. And spirituality the search for it. That true spirituality is there. It's infinite. But spirituality, we know, is not the end point. Just like our progress as people, we're not at the end point yet. Spirituality is the journey, just as we are on a journey. And our journey is tangible. It's measurable. You can look at it and be like, oh my goodness, there was this, and now there's that. And you know what? We still got so far to go. And our spirituality is what allows us to escape each station. I have a very strong passion for the right to vote, the right to express your opinions and your feelings and just your personal politics, whatever it is, at the ballot box. 100 years ago, you had to pay one tax. Now, that poll tax has a slightly different look, but it's kind of the same thing, and we're trying to escape it. So spirituality enables people to work together, provides a common bond for them to work together. One of the things I mentioned, one of the results of the survey that I took was very surprising, that African Americans who responded to the survey, and there was less than 100, small sample size, that part's true, it's less than 100, agreed to a 100% certainty that spirituality was personal, but they enjoy sharing it with others. Spirituality is amazing. It does provide an escape for African Americans, the same as it does for any other group. But not only is it integral to who we are, it's necessary and important. And I think it would be ultimately too dismissive to not include it as a part of discussions of who we are as people. I think spirituality by definition is not only a form of escapism, but it's in fact historically a necessary form of escapism. It's not that many, but most African Americans, self-reporting, who have been interviewed and surveyed, not just by myself, but also by professional surveyors and social science.
All right, Tre, that's your time. We will now move on to Catina Taylor arguing.
All right, so anyone that knows me knows that I'm a follower of Simon Sinek. He talks a lot about finite thinking versus the infinite game. For purposes of this particular argument, Tre's talked about not couching things in a finite way or in an infinite or finite way, yeah. And that we must address and look at and think of these things in terms of the infinite, game, so to speak. And I disagree with that based on the way in which the question was asked and the way in which we are debating the topic. That being said, 30 years after John Wellwood coined the phrase of spiritual bypassing, which we now call spiritual escapism, he did an interview and he was asked to define and explain what spiritual bypassing or escapism is. And I want to share with you a part of this interview. He said, when we are spiritually bypassing, we often use the goal of awakening or liberation to rationalize what I call premature transcendence. And then he went on to explain that. Premature transcendence means trying to rise above the raw and messy side of our humanness before we have fully faced and made peace with it. And then we tend to use absolute truth to disparage or dismiss relative human needs, feelings, psychological problems, relational difficulties, or developmental deficits. He says, I see this as an occupational hazard of the spiritual path, in that spirituality does not involve a vision of going beyond our current karmic situation. My position is that doesn't sound like African American people, but more like our oppressors. No more than liberation from cancer is a form of escapism from disease can we look at spirituality as a form of escapism. Enlightenment being a form of escaping from the world is like extreme wealth being a form of escaping from poverty, a perfect love being a form of escaping from loneliness, and a complete happiness being a form of escaping from sadness. Is it a form of escaping? The pursuit of it is, yes, very often motivated by the desire to escape reality one can't or doesn't want to deal with. The drive to escape doesn't lead to enlightenment. It leads to spiritual sounding, separation, withdrawal, and avoidance, as I said before. It leads to the witness who sits back, away from life, disconnected from life, and unaffected by life. That this witness is a step towards enlightenment is a common idea, yes, but I'll say again, this idea is not accurate. Achieving enlightenment, achieving liberation requires full and complete presence with everything as everything. It requires a complete, total acceptance of everything and immersion in everything. It requires moving towards plunging in and becoming completely one with everything. That is the very opposite of escaping and avoiding. The higher road is to understand the unreality behind our illusions and free our minds. Do you think it's easier to stand alone as an awake person than to be part of a large group of dreamers? Not hardly. It takes fearlessness to seek after deeper truth. Your thoughts are different from most. You can end up feeling like you're the only person in the world like yourself. Do you think that that is an easy road? It takes courage and strong belief in self to take that road. Escapism? I think not.
Thank you so much, Catina. Thank you also to, I want to thank both of you for participating in the great debate league tonight. Again, Tre Scott arguing the negative and Catina Taylor Tre Scott arguing the affirmative, forgive me, and Catina Taylor arguing the negative. It is our pleasure to create thought-provoking discussion on critical issues where we are able to learn from both of our presenters, and we did just that tonight. Thank you to our judges, Familio Equindeo, Talani Deskins, and Adonica Shaw. Please use the scorecard to let us know how you scored each participant's performance. Each debater's performance is scored based on fact-based arguments. So did they provide facts to support their arguments? Subject matter expertise. Did they demonstrate an understanding to the subject matter? Persuasiveness. Were their arguments logical and convincing? Elocution. Did they possess clear and effective communication? And rebuttals. Did they address their opponent's arguments? Thank you also to tonight's sponsor, They Know Joey Foundation. Thank you, audience, for watching and submitting questions. We appreciate your support to keep this program running. Please donate to our Cash App so that we can continue to grow. Also, please check us out on YouTube and subscribe and become a member of our Patreon page. We invite you to join us after this broadcast for the post-debate analysis, which will start shortly. Have a great night and remember to speak the truth.